evening, and thank you so much for coming. This is the fourth author event in our 2017 Books and Authors Festival. It's a collaboration between Falmouth Public Library and A Cousins Bookstore. My name is Mary Fran Bunkley. I'm one of the owners. Eileen Miskell will be selling books. She's in the back. And Kasha, I don't know if back there, is the person from the library who has done the coordinating. And we want to give a special thank you to the Board of Trustees for the library who have provided the financial support for this festival. So I'd like to introduce you to B.A Shapiro. Hi. As with the other authors we had on Saturday, who had a few careers before settling on writing for a full-time occupation, so did Barbara. Her few careers before settling on writing, and she calls them her career incarnations, include directing research projects for a residential substance abuse facility, working as a systems analyst/statistician, heading the Boston office of a software development firm, and serving as an adjunct professor in sociology at Tufts University and in creative writing at Northeastern University. Wow. After the birth of her second child, she decided to quit her high-pressure job, but was at a loss for what to do next. It was her mother who asked the important question: if you had 1 year to live, how would you want to spend it? Her answer: she wanted to write a novel and spend more time with her children. So she did just that, and thus began her successful writing career. 7 novels, 4 screenplays, and 1 nonfiction book later, Barbara declares, "I like being a novelist the best," for which we are grateful. Thank you. Her novel, The Art Forger, a New York Times bestseller, received many awards, among which are the 2013 New England Book Award for Fiction, the 2012 Boston Authors Society Award for Fiction, and the 2012 New England Society of New York Award for Fiction. It was named one of the Boston Globe's top mysteries of 2012 and was nominated for the McCavity Award for Best Mystery of 2012. The Muralist has also received critical acclaim. Scott Turow said, "The Muralist is a tantalizing mystery, as well as involving meditation on the meaning of art over time." B.A. Shapiro once again pens the art world into vivid, sensual life. If you liked The Art Forger, you're going to love The Muralist. And that's from our author, Lisa Genova. So welcome, Barbara.
Thank you.
I think for starters, for people who haven't read the book, if you could just give a brief overview of what happened, not the ending, what happens in the book.
Just The Muralist or The Art Forger too?
I'd say that, well, The Muralist, I'd say.
Okay. Well, I'll start with The Art Forger.
Okay. That works.
So, actually, I wrote, as you just heard, 5 books before The Art Forger. The problem was nobody read them. They came out and they died. And then I wrote 4 more that never even got published. So, and all of these had been in either the genre of psychological suspense. I wrote some women's stuff. I did a bunch of different things. And none of it was really working very well. So I came up with the idea for The Art Forger, which is about the Isabella Stewart Gardner museum heist. And it's also about a struggling writer, a struggling artist in Boston. And the mystery revolves around one of the paintings that was stolen during the heist, and whether she did or didn't forge it, and where it may be. So it had history in it, it had a mystery, it was historical because there's parts that are just about Bill Gardner, And it also, mystery, history, art, and some romance in there. And when I went to sell it, we couldn't sell it. It took me forever to get an agent. We were turned down by every major publisher in New York because they said it didn't fit into a genre. And if it didn't fit into a genre, they didn't know how to sell it to booksellers or to librarians. And so my publisher, Algonquin Books, which is the best publisher as far as writers, they're a writer's publisher. And they have they weren't afraid to publish a book that didn't fit into a genre. And after it had been turned down by everybody, it hit the New York Times bestseller list. So we were pretty excited. So then I decided, well, here was a pretty good, set up this non-genre book. So I decided to write another one that had history, mystery, art, and romance in it. And I was trying to figure out what I should write about. And so I thought, well, what time do I want to be in? And it takes me 3 to 4 years to write a book. So I better be interested in what I'm going to be writing about. So I'd always been really interested in the Depression. And my parents had grown up during the Depression. I was really interested in how it had affected them and what it was like in those times. So I decided I'm going to write about the Depression. And once I started doing some research, I discovered that when you put the Depression and art together, you come up with the WPA, Roosevelt's program to get the people back to work, and you come up with abstract expressionism. Because it turns out that working for the WPA in the late 1930s in New York City were a number of very well-known artists. Of course, they weren't well-known then. They were just Jack and Mark and me. And they turned into Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, Lee Krasner, Willem de Kooning was there, Hans Hofmann. I mean, it was just an amazing moment in time. And so I thought, cool, I'll write a book about these real people, and I'll just plunk my fictional characters in it. And then I discovered that Eleanor Roosevelt, my very favorite person in all of history, she's the only person I've ever done research on who turns out to be better than her. That she was instrumental in getting the artist involved in the WPA, and she was very interested in it and worked within it. And so I thought, cool, I'll make her a character too. And then I found out that on her deathbed, what she said to her son was her greatest regret in life was not helping more refugees get out of Europe before World War II, not forcing Franklin to get more refugees out. So I thought, cool, I'm going to get all the politics in here. Who were the people that she fought against? Well, it was more familiar names, Joe Kennedy and Charles Lindbergh and, all of these people. So what the book is, it's the story of a young woman who is working for the WPA, and she's trying to get her family out of France right before, actually after the Nazis had taken over the country. And she's hanging out with Jackson Pollock, and Mark Rothko is her lover, and Lee Krasner is her best friend. And at the beginning of the book, you discover that she has disappeared. In 1940, out of nowhere, she disappeared after making enemies of of Charles Lindbergh and Joe Kennedy and another really nefarious guy named Breckinridge Long. So it's the story of her and what happened to her and the mystery of how it all turned out.
Well, now you've taken all my questions.
I know, I feel exactly.
But one thing that I find interesting with historical fiction, you have a lot of pitfalls because as you say in your afterword, it's a work of fiction. However, you've got all these historic figures, you've got facts, you've got the memo from Long that really did him in the long run. And so I'm sure when people read it, even on the afterword, it states explicitly it's a work of fiction. I'm sure there are people who say, but you got this wrong, or you didn't do that. So how do you navigate the...
You know, with email and websites and stuff, anybody can say anything to you. Some of them aren't all that nice either. But mostly what I get are things that are nice. I've been on panels with other historical novelists, and the line between fact and fiction in historical novels is, you know, it's like everything else, it's kind of gray. So there are some people, I don't know, Dawn Tripp has been here. She's a very good friend, and it's a novel, but she gets almost every single fact right. So she weaves her story around that. I was on a panel with a historical romance writer, and she said, I think it was like in Elizabethan England or something, and she said, I don't really care about the facts, I just like the clothes. You know, and I'm much closer to Dawn, but a story comes first to me, and that's what this is. It's a story. So what I do is I want to know all the facts. And then, as I work with the writers group, and we have many sayings, one of them is don't let the truth get in the way of a good story. And so and I like to use the facts, like the thing about Eleanor Roosevelt. I mean, the facts give you really good ideas for stories, but if they're not so good, then I'm finishing up a book now, and what I do is anything that I write that isn't true, I underline. And then when I'm finished with the book, I will write an afterword that says these are the things that aren't true. If people don't like it, they don't like it. So a lot of times people have written to me, and it's like, it's in the afterword. Or the best one is that I got all the time at the Art Forger. So the center of that story is a Degas painting that was stolen. And so I didn't want, well, first of all, I worried with that if, what if they solved the heist? You know, while I'm writing it, it wouldn't be good. So I'm safe. Yeah, unfortunately, I'm safe. And so I decided I would make up a painting. So I looked at all of Degas' paintings, and he had a number of them that were called After the Bath. So I made up like the 5th After the Bath. And, you know, I drew it out, knew what it looked like, and I described it and all of this. And people, one after another kept saying, I Googled Degas and 3 bathers, and he never painted a painting with 3 bathers. Yeah, it's a novel.
I think it was interesting, we heard Amor Toll speak last week, and for him, the same thing. He said the story comes first for him. He gets an idea, puts the story in, and then he adds the facts. So his thing is the story first. I know that Vernonia Barry said, she writes about Salem, and she lives there, and she said, I have got to get every street and building absolutely correct, because it's in the current time. So I think if you write about the past, like Elizabethan, you've got a little leeway there.
So is Toll's wonderful?
Yes. He was quite good. Eileen and I went over to Marston's Mills, and he gave a wonderful talk. He's very interesting, but so methodical. I mean,
we are.
Oh, he was absolutely the outline, and
me too.
Yeah, wow. Okay. You should meet him.
I'd love to meet him. Gentleman in Moscow.
Yeah,
really
good.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
I know that you spoke at a Cousins a few years ago after the publication of The Art Forger, and one thing we were discussing in the book group at the store was the Lilac Girls. And Carol Chittenden just remarked that you made a comment in your talk about your research is showing. And so she really loved that phrase, saying, you know, you don't want it to be strictly, it's not a nonfiction historical tract. It's a story. And
Right, that line, your research is showing is another line from my writers group. And what happens is you do all of this research and you're fascinated by it and you find out all of this stuff. And so you want to write about it. And so you do. And the reader doesn't really want to read all of that stuff. That what I've come to learn is that it really is the tip of the iceberg that people want. And that it's a novel. And that's what is important. But it's hard when you get so fascinated by things, you start thinking everybody else will. But that's why you need a writer's group to tell you, no, I don't think anybody really cares.
But you learn so much. I mean, I learn more from a novel, I think, because of the way you absorb it. It's not like facts for a history test or something like that. And I will say one of the things I loved in the Art Forger, I learned how to do a forgery. And it never occurred to me that they'd have to find a canvas. They couldn't just go out and buy one that had to be from that period. The paints had to be mixed. Everything had to be so exact.
Well, in that book and also in The Muralist, I mean, I want, I was talking about the abstract expressionists, and, you're talking about having real characters. So I read all of these biographies of all of these people. I went to the Pollock Krasner house. I interviewed people about abstract expressionism, read tons of books on it. And again, it was only the tip of the iceberg, and it was the same with the forgeries. I read tons of books on how to do it, but as detailed as that was only a fraction of what I knew at the time about forgery.
But you were trained as a sociologist, weren't you? So, but you certainly have a lot of knowledge of art, I would say.
Yeah, I have a PhD in sociology because that's what all writers need. Very important.
Very 60s.
Far from that. But what I really think a writer needs is to be a reader. That's what I always, fiction. I had no training in fiction at all, writing fiction. I was a sociologist. I haven't read, most of the great works. I was too busy taking sociology classes instead of English classes, but reading novels all the time. I am a total and complete novel addict. People have asked me, a lot of writers, when they're working on a book, don't like to read, if they're novelists, they don't like to read other novels while they're working. If I couldn't read other novels while I was working, I wouldn't be a novelist.
Interesting. So in your writing, do you, because I think in the Lilac Girls, Martha Kelly, I think there's an idea that, or a history that really caught her. Do you have a spark? Do you have what is your inspiration for writing? A certain interest, you said you were interested in the Depression, and is that kind of how you evolve it, or does something happen and you think, oh, that would be a great book or a novel?
There are many, many times that I see something and I think, oh, this would be a great novel. The vast majority of them don't work. So sometimes it's that. With the Art Forger, I just moved to Boston. We live in the middle of the city, and I was walking distance to the Gardner and to the MFA. We live in the South End, where there are a lot of artists and a lot of artist studios, and so I just thought, well, I'll write about art. And then, I had been living in Boston during the heist, and I thought, well, I'll do that. And then with The Muralist, it was, as I was saying, that I started out with just wanting to write about art in the Depression, and then doing research. I'm an academic by training, so I'm really very good at research. And but I'm sure there are some academics in the room here tonight. And when you do research, you have to go to every last citation for every person who is breathed on your subject. It's really tedious, which is one of the reasons I got out of academia. But when you're doing research for a novel, you just do it until you're not interested anymore, and then you make the rest of it up. It works out just great.
I thought that in one part in the Muralist, Ali says she talks about her art, and she said, and she's talking with her friend Mark Rothko about her class, and I'll just read, I took a paragraph from the book. Mark said it was becoming something it already was, that he hadn't been aware of until she showed him, which was exactly right. But she hadn't been aware of it either, not until the figures showed themselves. And maybe that was the point. She hadn't been trying to find them, she allowed them to find her. And he has a similar, learning from her, he has a similar experience of that it came to him. And I've heard writers say that their characters come to them, that they almost hear them speaking to them. Is that similar? Do you have a similar experience like that? Which seems almost unreal to me in a way. But.
Well, I have obviously many friends who are writers, and they talk about, sitting at the computer and suddenly the characters come alive and they gallop off with the story, and the writer is like hanging on to the keyboard for dear life. This has never happened. I know that it has to be true because I know these people and they're dear friends and they wouldn't lie to me. But so what I do is, actually my background, not only am I a sociologist, but just to bend a little bit even more, my area of specialization is statistics. So I use mathematical ways to write my novels because nobody shows up, so that's all I have to count on.
So how do you use math for? That's fascinating.
It's really kind of sick. So none of you probably know because I made it up, but every plot follows a normal curve. This is true for main plots, for subplots, for character arcs, and it can be every normal curve can be divided into 4 parts. The major piece of each point is a major turning point in the story. I also use, so I do that. I map out all the plots. I map out all the characters. I also use bubblegrams to assess the relationships between the characters. If these 2 people are going to end up together doing something here, well, they have to meet somewhere through somebody else. And, particularly when you have a mystery, I like to create these kind of, suspenseful mysteries. So all the pieces have to be tied up. One of the things that I like the most is something I call a tension chart. So as I'm writing, every scene I assign a tension coefficient to. So, for example, you read a scene, sometimes you got to set things up, and you can't have a scene with no tension in it because that would be incredibly boring. But sometimes you have to have ones that aren't all that much. Sometimes after a big one, you got to drop down, give the reader a little space. So those get a tension coefficient of 0.25. Then they get a little bit more exciting, and that gets a 0.50. If it's really, really exciting, like there's lots of tension and there's lots of stuff going on in that scene, it's a 0.75. But the really, really, really big scenes get the big 1.0, which corresponds to those 4 places on the normal curve. Then I do something really sophisticated that, unless you're a statistician, you're probably not going to understand, so you're not understanding it already. Well, all right, I'll tell you anyway. I use multicolored file cards. And so, for example, in The Muralist, so I mapped out Eleanor Roosevelt's arc. And she had 12 different major plot points. So I took 12 yellow file cards and I wrote each one of them down. I did the same thing for Mark Rothko. I did the same thing for Breckenridge Long, who is the villain in the book. And I was looking for black file cards for these. So I got this dark purple. I got dark purple file cards, and I plotted him out, and I plotted out all of the other characters, and I plotted out the evolution of abstract expressionism, and I plotted out the war and what was going on. And each one is in a different color. So then I end up with a stack of file cards like this, many different colors, and I lay them out on my dining room table and move them around, trying to get them to create a story that makes sense. And then when I get it, then I take my stack of file cards and I go upstairs and I start to write.
That's amazing.
I told you it was a little sick.
Every author we've talked to everybody has his or her own approach. So just to deviate a bit from writing, one of the things that's fascinating in the book to me is the similarity for what was going on then with what is going on now. And Breckenridge Long we've got similar characters now. I don't think somebody today could get away with what he did in the book.
Don't be so sure.
Well,
We're not going to go there, are we?
No, we're not going to go there. But it is very interesting. Alize, she's desperate to get these relatives out, and she doesn't have money, and she keeps thinking, she can buy a visa, but they're not issuing visas, even though they're supposed to be issued, but there's been sort of a blockade. And she goes to the economic recovery? No, it's ERC.
ERC is,
I have
see, we were talking about this, my brain cell, I'm totally into the next book. So, Emergency Rescue Council.
Emergency Rescue Council.
I pulled it out.
And she's told by the man who's the assistant director that Americans don't want immigrants coming. They're afraid. They are afraid they'll take their jobs. And it's, of course, the United States is coming off the Depression, but we're also coming off a recession, technology and all its advances, people losing their jobs. So it's in many ways, a similar situation. And they do say that the refugee crisis, the numbers of people, hasn't been seen since World War II. So it's very similar. So did you, not intentionally, but it probably just happened?
Well, what happened was, so Alize is trying to get her family out of France, and they need visas. And so she tries to get the visas, and Joe Kennedy and Charles Lindbergh and Breckenridge Long are working not to let anybody in. Mostly because they were virulently anti-Semitic, but also they made the excuses that these immigrants would take jobs. They made excuses that they were undercover Germans and they were going to come in and create wars here. All of this, when I wrote this book 4 years ago, and I was focusing on the idea that we never learn, that we keep making the same damn mistakes over and over again. And these guys, and unfortunately, they always are men, who want to run the world and want it to look exactly the way they want it to look, get into power, and they want everybody to be just the way they are. And if you're not, get out of my way. So they come in and they make war, and people die. And refugees are forced out of where they are and out of their own lives and their own countries, and then nobody wants to take them in. And that was what I was focused on, the mistakes that we keep making over and over again. The book came out just as the Syrian crisis started. So I had not been thinking, the book is about refugees, but I hadn't been thinking about that as much as I was thinking about war, and making the same mistakes. And then I realized that that is what I was writing about, was about refugees being thrown out of their lives and, nobody wanting them. And it was kind of haunting, that this was happening again. And now there are things that are happening again that, in this country that are, reminiscent of some of the stuff that happened in Europe before World War II. We don't ever learn. That's...
And I think too, when you operate from fear, there's no rational thinking, and they're instilling this fear in people turns them against the other. I think you did use that phrase in the book. Yeah,
that's what it's all about. It's us and them. It's me and the other. And this is something that I think probably helped us when we were in the caves, but doesn't work all that well now. If I don't know you, you're my enemy, I'm going to kill you. It's a different world now, but our instincts apparently seem to be the same. Boy, this is depressing.
Back to fiction.
This is why we read fiction.
Exactly.
This.
One thing I thought too was interesting. I have always thought the WPA was just a wonderful thing. Yet the artists aren't so enamored of the program because they're dictated to in some ways. And I didn't realize that. I mean, I know there were all the series of books written and then, but gave people jobs and got them going. Yeah.
The WPA, when it comes to artists, so they had, mainly what the WPA did was create jobs for plumbers and carpenters, and they built buildings and did things like that. And as I said, Eleanor Roosevelt was instrumental in having them include artists. It was called the FAP, the Federal Art Project. And they took artists and they paid them a living wage to create art. What a concept, and they did. They created, they did murals, they did individual pieces, they did graphics, they did sculptures. It was just an amazing thing, and it actually created the school of abstract expressionism, which turns out to be the first school of American art that we then exported to Europe. Everything before this had been exported here, so we had to import it. So, it was just a phenomenal idea. But as with everything, they did have their rules, and they did not like modern art. And they wanted certain kinds of art because, people are always afraid of new ideas. The book I'm working on now is about the post-impressionists. It takes place in the 1920s. And they didn't want the post-impressionists. They had Matisse and Cezanne. They were like, oh God, these people are demented. And they didn't like impressionism. And they didn't, it's like, this is what it is. So there were rules, and it was bad, but I'm sure all of the artists, all the ones that I spoke to and everything that I read, were incredibly grateful to be able to make a living wage, during the Depression, creating art.
And the murals that exist today, I think, are really so wonderful to see. Yeah.
The Coit Tower in San Francisco is my favorite.
Yeah.
If you get a chance to go out there, it's just amazing. They restored it, and it's just beautiful. That's just beautiful.
And there were writers. They did, I want to say travel writing, but sectional writing about the United States. So they were very focused on artists or creative people.
It was amazing.
Yeah.
How times change.
I can't think of another question right now, but I'm sure there are people who would want to ask. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just curious. You said you had written all these books before one took off. And I'm wondering, after your book started to take off, did people go back and read the first books?
So the question is, after all those books that I read that wrote that nobody read, did people start going back and reading them? Well, they wouldn't have been able to because everything was out of print. But fortunately, they are now available as ebooks and paperbacks. So people have been going back and reading them. And they like my newer ones better, but that's okay. I'm just really glad because, you know, these were dead. I mean, they created them and then they were gone. And now they've been resurrected. So it's all good.
And your screenplays, I mean, they're...
Screenplays, nothing, but I won some contests and I got some managers and we were excited and nothing happened. And I went back to writing novels and nothing happened. And I wrote another novel and nothing happened. And then I wrote The Art Forger and everything happened.
Did you have an agent during that whole period?
I had many agents. Because what happened, so I had one agent who did, so I wrote a book and got an agent and that didn't sell because generally people's first books don't sell. Then I got another agent and we sold 4 books, which was pretty cool, but nobody read them. And then I wrote another one and she didn't like it, so I got another agent and that we couldn't sell that. So that agent wasn't interested, so when I wrote another one, I had to get a different agent. And then that happened, that was dumped. Then I had to go get a different agent for the next one. So I've been through a lot of agents. The one I have now, she's stuck with me. When we were turned down by everybody for the Art Forger, everybody. And she said, we're not stopping. We're not stopping. I'm not stopping till we get this book published.
And your nonfiction book, did that?
The nonfiction book I wrote because I wasn't getting my fiction published, and I just wanted to get something published. And that didn't sell very well either.
Well, we have in the store, we're going to have Chelsea Clinton at the store next
Oh,
week.
cool.
Boy. But her book is She Persisted.
Yes.
So,
Where I have 2 little granddaughters,
Oh.
and I just bought a copy for them.
Yes, ma'am.
So how many years did you spend writing before you actually got a bestseller?
25.
So it was persistence.
She persisted.
Anybody else?
Oh, come on, I'm a teacher.
I'm trying.
I'm going to follow. Somebody,
I have a question. In your research, I had read that Diego Rivera was big on murals, and he was paid to that.
Diego Rivera is
You
it?
know, he's from Mexico.
Yeah, he would. Yeah, you had to be American to work for the WPA, but he was doing murals around the same time.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, come on, nobody from over there. Yep, there's somebody over there.
So when you were doing your research, did you research like each artist and their character and their personality reflected accurately in the book, and the same with the three men, you researched all of them?
Yeah, so what I did is, sometimes I think, because my characters don't, come to me and go galloping off, I think of myself often as an actor. And so if I'm going to write about a person, or like in the case of this book, like Mark Rothko is a viewpoint character, Ellen Roosevelt's a viewpoint character, I want to study them the way I imagine an actor studies for a part. So I read as much as I can, I take notes, I visit places where they lived, if it wasn't possible for this book, but if somebody is still alive, and talk to them and find out as much as I possibly can about the person. So that when I go to write about them, obviously it's fiction, I have no idea what these conversations were, but I like to think that I have them act and speak and think in the ways that they would have had they been in this particular situation, which is why it took me 4 years to write the book.
Yes, ma'am.
What's your projected date for your next book?
My next book, hopefully, actually I have a big deadline tomorrow, so I was like writing until 2 o'clock, jumped in the car, drove down here, pulled out my computer, worked until 5:45. I can get up really early tomorrow and drive back. So hopefully, we're planning on fall of 2018. And it's another history, mystery, art, and romance book. This one is about the Post-Impressionists. And it takes place in Paris and Philadelphia. And so, and this also has real people in it. So in The Art Forger, she may or may not have had an affair with Degas. In The Muralist, the protagonist does have an affair with Mark Rothko. And in the new book, the protagonist has an affair with Andre Matisse. And Philadelphia's, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Barnes Foundation and Albert Barnes. So it's kind of about him. He's not dissimilar to Isabella Stewart Gardner in some ways, but even more of a character. So it's kind of about that. And so they're hanging out, they're going to Paris and hanging out in Gertrude Stein's salon with, Matisse and Picasso and Fitzgerald and Hemingway. I'm having a lot of fun with it. It's also been really nuts.
I'm sorry.
I don't have 25 years, but I've written a book, so I want the shortcut. And I've heard that self-publishing is not the way to go, because then you've got to flog your book to every book group in planet Earth.
Yes. Self-publishing, did you write a novel?
Yes.
Yeah, self-publishing novels is very difficult. Self-publishing, if you write something and you've got a niche and you can market it to websites for, autism or French history or whatever it is. The problem is that you have to get your book in front of the public. And even, like those 5 books that I wrote that nobody read, I was HarperCollins, Avon Books, because they publish so many books. These big publishers publish, 300, 400 books a month, every month.
Yes.
So ask the
I
So the number of books that anybody even knows about are infinitesimal. And even then, after they're in the library and in the bookstore, the people have to have read them and be hand selling them or telling people about them. So when you're self-publishing, you're like starting down here, and you may think you know a lot of people, but the truth is that you don't actually know that many people. Because I remember from my early books, I would tell people, I make my really good friends come to multiple places. It's like, okay, you come to Boston, you come to Cambridge, you come to Concord, and the crowds were not large. But on the other hand, it happened to me.
It's magic.
And it happens, it does happen. So get yourself a good agent.
So what is your name of your agent? And I know it's in the thank you.
Actually, I'll let you know.
I'm going to come up afterwards.
I was curious how a library would categorize your book, because I remember they had one that had 2 designations and they had to buy 2 books. Like a mystery or a history. They were arguing about, I don't know if that was the subject. So they decided to buy multiple books. So
We have your fiction.
Well, it depends how small you want to get the categories.
Historical fiction.
It's historical fiction, but see, like The Art Forger wasn't really historical fiction, so it's, and the thing is, it's like, it's all about sales. So these large publishers, they have, they've got a few really big names, and those are the names that they promote. And then the names that you know, they do some promotion for. But the other 250 or 300 books, they need categories for. So they can say, here are our 40 mysteries, here are our 50 romances, here's our sci-fi, here's our this. And that's how they sell them. So that's why and then bookstores and libraries have to shelve them in a way that people can find them. And human beings love categories, and that's the way our minds work. So it's a risk to cross genres until it works, and then it's great.
Yes.
In your investigation, Ms. Ellen, or so forth, do you think FDR was anti-Semitic?
So the question is, from my reading, do I think FDR was anti-Semitic? One thing that we have to remember is that at that point in time, pretty much everybody was anti-Semitic. In New York City in the late 1930s, there were signs on restaurants that said, you know, no Jews, no N-word, you know, and they were there. And I asked I'm Jewish, and I asked my mother, I said, how did you feel? She said, well, we just felt that we were not going to go someplace where we weren't wanted. And so I think yes, and given his background and where he was at that moment in time, you know, he was internally, subconsciously anti-Semitic, because you can't help it. You know, you're brought up in the world, and those are the norms. My sociologist, the norms and the values of that world, you just adopt. On the other hand, he had a great number of Jews in his cabinet and who were there, and
So
I
did
don't
Trump.
think, pardon?
So did Trump.
No. Okay, let's not go there. But ultimately, I mean, Roosevelt could have said, let those refugees in, and he didn't, because he had other things that he had to bargain for, and it was politically expedient for him to let that go. And, you know, we see that happening everywhere. Even, you know, really, really good guys, you have to make some compromises. Some people don't want to make any compromises, but we won't talk about that. So I guess my answer is yes and no. It's hard to know. Eleanor was not. She was not. She was willing to stand up at a time when people were not willing to stand up.
She couldn't convince him.
She couldn't convince him, right. She tried, and she could not convince him to fire Breckenridge Lawn.
Hi. This is just a comment. You are as entertaining and informative as you were years ago when I saw you in the Western Public Library, and the Art Forger had just come out. And the next day, the library called and said, come on, pick it up. I could not put it down. But it turned my whole concept of museums upside down.
Cool.
You were correlated from then on until now. And when I go into a museum, down deep I start, because you described how you had to get the canvas that age period. And the enemy was kind of mischief and wanted to go up to a painting. Just out of the, just give it a little scratch.
Don't touch. Well, thank you very much.
But it was a great book. It just, I couldn't put it down. I just don't look at pictures in museums. I question them now. You know,
So is this a good thing or a bad thing?
Yes, ma'am.
Tell us a little bit about your writers group, how you found it, how it works, and are they just friends or?
Well, my writers group was and is amazing. So after I wrote that first book that couldn't get published, I decided that, oh, maybe I should learn how to write. So I took a class at the Cambridge Center for Adult Ed in novel writing. And I met a bunch of other students in the class, and we formed a writers group. None of us had ever written fiction before. You know, we're journalists, they're magazine writers, you know, I'd written a dissertation, but we had not read fiction. And there were 4 of us who worked together for about 18 years. And we taught each other how to write. We were totally focused, and we were only writing novels. That's all we did. We didn't, even if other people were writing things, they did not bring them to the group. It was only about novels. And we worked on the ideas as well as the words, and we would take, at that time we had a ski house up in Vermont, so we used to go up in the summers with the writers group and just spend a week there critiquing each other and doing all kinds of stuff. And this is the most remarkable thing. The last of the four of us just got her first book published, Diane Bonavest, and she actually lives on the Cape also. That is the 16th published novel that the four of us together have produced. Unfortunately, people moved and got jobs and did stuff, and then there were two of us, and we included other people in the group. Actually, probably you've had Helia from here, Linda Barnes. So we were in writers groups with them, and then we decided that they weren't helpful enough, that we were helping them more than they were helping us. So now there's just two of us in the writers group. It's a very exclusive group.
How about the importance of an editor, a good editor? Yeah.
A good editor is the best gift that a writer can get. I have a fabulous editor. I worked with her on both of these books and this new one. So, for example, I worked on the new book for 3 years, and she had seen little parts of it, but I sent her the whole big, I'd rewritten it, I don't know, 7, 8 times. Every page of my books have been rewritten at least 20 times. It's all about rewriting. And so I gave her a 450-page manuscript. She read it, did track changes, and so there were 631 comments on the pages, not counting additions and subtractions. So that was just on the pages. We talked for hours and hours and hours, multiple times, and I'm handing a manuscript in tomorrow that is 372 pages. And it is so much better and so much tighter, and I'm so much happier with it. And, she did that. That's what she did.
And I think too, with a small house like Algonquin, you do get that type of attention that you may
It's
not.
amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you get, and they don't pressure me. So, like I had a contract to, so I had 3 books, and it was 2 years, 2 years, 2 years. And so the Art Forger was finished, so that was easy. The Muralist took me 4 years instead of 2. So by the time I started working on this book, I was already past my deadline. Nobody said a word. It's been over 3 years. They want a quality book more than they want, a book on time, and that's rare.
Yeah, and I think too, for a self-published person, you do miss that piece, I think, of having a good editor, But it's hard to get into.
It's hard, but it actually is my favorite time rewriting. The part I hate the most is the first draft, when you sit there every day and you're staring at that empty screen, but when you're rewriting, you have something to start with, and then you can go. And it's also really easy to get into the zone rewriting. And so I have been up against this this tight deadline, and because it has to go into production by the end of August in order for it to come out next fall.
Yeah.
So, I have literally been writing 10, 12 hours a day, every day for the past few months. It's just really been crazy.
Any movies in the offing? That's always one of the big questions.
Yeah, movies. So we actually just fired our film agent. Really, she couldn't get the Art Forger made. Give me a break. Not only would it make a great movie, but it would be cheap. And she couldn't sell the Muralist either, so when the new book comes out, we'll try again, you know. But Reese Witherspoon almost did it. We came this close. I was on the phone multiple times with her partner, and then she goes off and makes Wild.
The nerve.
That's the closest we came.
Yes, ma'am.
One last question. How important is it to have romance as part of that mosaic that you wove?
It depends, yeah, what are you asking, romance or sex?
Well, I know, I'm saying that the biggest piece of the pie, and courses that I have taken, is romance. I mean, the biggest piece of the pie that sells seems to be romantic novels.
Yes and no. People who buy romance, you know, the actual real romance novels, and people who buy, you know, series mysteries and things like that, these people buy hundreds of books a year, and they read them like candy. So yes, you can sell a lot of those books, but you know, like I learned with the Art Forger, you know, you need to take risks and you need to do what you want to do. So I would say there is nothing that you should do, that you should include. What you want to do is create this story that is its own world, and that people do the things in it that make sense given who they are and given the world they're in. And, you know, if there's no romance, there's no romance.
Yes, ma'am.
I did the art forger a few years ago and loved it. Just a few days ago, I finished it for the second time.
Oh, she read it twice.
I loved it just as much the second time.
Thank you.
There wasn't one sentence where I could constantly criticize.
She said there was no sentence she could criticize. Unfortunately, many others have done so.
Yeah, I think that, yes, ma'am. One last.
Kudos to the Falmouth Library for
Yes,
putting the Art
absolutely.
Forger as one of their book group books. And when there are kits that you can pick up at the library, for those of you who don't know. And the Art Forger was one of them. Our book group just did that and borrowed them and read that book, and it was just wonderful.
Thank
And
you.
then I went
Thank
to
you.
the Garden Museum,
Yeah.
incidentally, 2 days later, and I felt like you did. I looked at everything.
And I was going to end with one other thing that Amor Toll said that I thought was great, and it's sort of the trap you fall into for historical fiction. And he said, readers demand more factual accuracy in a novel than they do in their president. And Barbara will sign them for you, so have it signed.